I'm going to start with a small warning that there will be some politics in this talk. And how can there not be? How can you untangle politics from the idea of ethics, or even the idea of design? What I will say is, hopefully, even if you disagree with my conclusions, that at least you will accept or respect some of the questions that I ask in this talk. So the main case I'm going to make here is that it's time for our industry to really start taking ethics seriously. But ethics is quite a difficult topic to bring up. Really, I see there are two reasons for that. One is the history. When we think of ethics, we think of Aristotle, Kant, Popper, Rousseau. But ethics really isn't dusty history. It would be a terrible talk, I think, if I were to step through each of these philosophical luminaries and talk about their theories. I don't really want to do that, because ethics is really about the fundamental choices that we make day by day. It's vital, it's current. It's really nothing less than a pledge to take the decisions we make, the moral choices in our lives, to take those seriously. The second thing that makes talking about ethics difficult is there's no immediate gratification. There aren't any clear answers. Ethics is quite invisible. It's quite an abstract concept. So another thing that really I don't want to do is to give you definitive guidance. I don't want to put up examples and say, this is ethically correct. It doesn't really work that way. Instead, what I'm going to do is dive into a couple of areas in our practice that I think, they probably deserve deeper ethical consideration. Instead of answers, I'm going to pose questions. And hopefully these are questions that yourselves can ponder, and maybe they will ultimately change your behaviors. And one of the ideas that comes up in ethics a fair amount is this idea of playing God. It's a good entry point sometimes to ethical discussion. And when we talk about playing God, usually we're talking about where technology intervenes in patterns of life, conception, genetics, that sort of thing. Now we can abstract this. We can say really we're talking about any technological interference with the natural order of things, what would otherwise have happened without us intervening. So some examples of this might be genetic modification of a fetus, or selectively breeding dogs for desirable traits. Let's take that further. How about designing and developing medicines, the sort of medicines that mean that I didn't die from asthma as a child? How about if we design a lightning rod and we install it next to a football pitch so that during a thunderstorm, the football players aren't electrocuted, aren't killed? Let's take that even further. How about designing a table that prevents a vase from falling under the influence of gravity? My point here is that there are shades of grey, and it is, I think, accurate in some ways to say that design is the act of playing God. Our products intervene in our environments. They change outcomes. So the ethical challenges of affecting the natural order of things, a lot of those really, to me, are design challenges. Let's have a think about physical space. Physical space is shaped by a relatively select few: councils, architects, planners, governors. They create the destinations. They create the football stadiums, the shopping malls, the offices, the residential zones. They also create the route options, the transport infrastructure, roads, motorways, trains, footpaths, for us to get between those destinations. Now, in physical space, there is quite a strong democratic influence on these decisions. There's things like planning approval that these people have to push their applications through. There are accessibility laws about who can access that physical space. So generally, users, although they may not be directly involved in those decisions, they still have a strong say in them. There may be consultations about how to use this public space, or they may have other indirect capabilities, for instance, protest or the ballot box. When we consider digital space, we can see quite a few similarities. Again, there are destinations, there are sites, there are social networks, there are apps. And again, there are routing options, there are browsers, app stores that allow us to go between these destinations. And I contend that the way we inhabit digital spaces is actually quite similar to the way we inhabit physical space. In fact, there's a case for saying we spend more time in some of these spaces. I'd be very surprised if you all don't spend longer in your favorite social networking destination than you do, for instance, at your favorite shopping mall. Where digital space differs is that these spaces are far more under private control. Companies mostly make these spaces. They dictate how they can and should be used. They set the acceptable rules, the rules for acceptable behavior within those spaces. Generally, I think there's less of a democratic influence on digital space. Users have less of a say in setting the rules of some of those spaces. That's not to say they don't have influence, of course. One of the things about capitalism is if you're not happy with the service you're being delivered, then you are free, of course, to go to a competitor. But some digital spaces are becoming so pervasive that they're almost utilities. It's actually quite a big ask to say to a user, well, abandon these digital spaces where all of your friends are or that are almost habitual to you. So what this means for me is that it falls to people like you and me to create spaces, digital spaces that have a positive impact on the world. Because the users don't always get as strong a say as they would in physical space, we have to take their needs into account. We have to decide what a positive impact actually means. And I think ethics can really help us to untangle that problem. One of the very exciting and potentially scary things about digital is it offers the opportunity to get extraordinary scale at very low cost. The impact of digital design can be large. The design decisions that we take might influence or impact thousands of users, even millions of users, even in some cases billions of users. I think designers enjoy working at that kind of scale. I think we all recognize that we want to have impact in our work, and I'll also confess it's not bad for our egos to have that kind of scale as well. But these numbers, these millions and billions, these are just unfathomable to most of us. Now, we're not equipped to understand the magnitude of what 1 billion people looks like, or even 1 million people. We're really equipped to handle face-to-face interaction, one-to-one, parents, lovers, friends, that sort of thing. When we start thinking about groups, I think we really can't get our heads around it. Societies, populations, very difficult things. So it's easy when we talk about scale to let people turn into statistics. Let's say Facebook wants to run an experiment. I'm sure they run plenty. Let's say they choose 1% of their user base. Well, that's 10 million people. It's actually a bit more than that. That's more than the population of London. Designers, therefore, I think, have a duty when we're working with these large numbers that we have to still find a way to honor the individual stories within these populations. The user who loses access to precious photos because of a change in your policy. We need to find ways to have aggregate data supplemented with small-scale qualitative feedback. And then we need to discuss the priority that we afford those data points. Let's say we make a change and 90% of our user base likes it. 10% really hates it. Well, is that a net positive or a net negative intervention? Now, I say designers like scale. I think really all people who are technologically interested do. One of the things that we like to think of with the internet is that it's creating a global citizenry, a cosmopolitanism. One of the core concepts in cosmopolitanism is that we are collectively responsible for each other's well-being. It's an idea I really like. It's a powerful one. But to do that, we have to recognize that not everyone is the same. Because with scale comes diversity in our user bases. Again, in the physical world, we think of accessibility as creating cities and facilities that all can enjoy, including those who are less physically able. In digital space, we face similar questions about who can access and enjoy the digital spaces we make. Accessibility, I think, is sometimes seen as either a bit of a nuisance or a solved problem. As an engineering technique, you code it the right way and there we go, it's taken care of. I really don't see it that way. I see accessibility as a design and an ethical challenge. It's still very current to us. Really, accessibility for me is a value judgment. we're really making a value judgment of who is worth our effort. In fact, we're making a judgment on who we regard as human. So I think it's time we reframe accessibility as a key issue of social justice. I mean, to be blunt, I think if you knowingly create a product that isn't accessible, then you are directly contributing to the social repression of disabled people. Now, of course, there are laws, and obviously, yes, businesses will do what they can to adhere to those, but I think we need to be thinking more broadly about this. I think one role of ethics is therefore for us to help convince business that this sort of thing, accessibility issues and so on, they're not just about return on investment or avoiding class action lawsuits. They're also about doing what is right, acting with compassion and inclusivity and love. There are also access issues around that go beyond physical ability, also technical capabilities. If we make lazy assumptions about the technical capabilities of our users, then we also exclude. If we design something and test it only on a blazing fast 4G network and on the top-end handsets, then we isolate, we exclude essentially the people who aren't like us, mostly people who aren't Western and who aren't rich. Are we comfortable with that as a community? Are we happy to say that these people don't deserve our best efforts because they're less likely to be highly profitable to us? If we're not happy with that, well, how do we change our expectations? Another ethical crunch point for design is the issue of persuasion. It's a very important tool for us. It helps us achieve our goals. And there are a couple of types of persuasion that we participate in. One is that we try and persuade our stakeholders, our colleagues. We try to convince them that the approaches that we're setting forth are going to be beneficial. They're going to be the right way to tackle that problem. So how do we present our work? How do we offer that advice? I think the UX industry has historically taken quite a scientific stance when talking about its merits. And I think that's partially valid in some aspects. There are some techniques within the user-centered design toolkit, if you like, that will offer reduced risk, higher confidence in the designs you're about to put out there. User testing would be one. But is UX really as scientific as we claim? And the more I think about this issue, the less I see that UX meets the criteria of the scientific method. It's hard to quantify. It's certainly not replicable. So an approach that works in situation A is definitely not going to automatically translate to situation B. So that means that it's very contextual. That means there is really not much by way of objective truth in design. And I think as an industry, we step into dangerous territory here. Perhaps without realizing it, we overstate the rigor that we offer. Particularly, we're fond of leaning on explanations that fall into neuroscience. I have a sort of general principle that any design rationale that contains the words "your brain" is usually bullshit. Likewise, any blog posts that talk about why you should adopt a certain approach because of your brain. We don't know that much about the brain. I think we lean on it as a method to lend ourselves that extra credibility, but is it actually justified? Sometimes we also offer justification that simply has weak evidence. One example, a fairly trivial example of this, is the golden ratio. You're all familiar with the concept that this ratio, this proportion, is harmonious to the human brain. Well, there's little to no evidence that the golden ratio is special, has any kind of aesthetic appeal, but yet I still see it crop up as a justification for the solutions we proffer. So is it really right for the UX design community to use scientific associations to its advantage? And what role does it really play? Is it really to build trust, or is it instead to mythologize the craft, to create a wall of esoteric legitimacy that actually keeps others at a distance? Now, honestly, I think it's probably both. The ethical designer for me is someone who's aware of that challenge and who speaks with honesty about the rigor that she offers. Now, the better the designer, the more I mature within the field, the more I feel that the better designers are the ones who are less categorical with their language. They're the ones who call it a hunch, if it is a hunch. Great thing about that is it offers headroom for certainty. When you are convinced that this is the right approach, you have that leeway and people will listen. Another place that we persuade is obviously when we're talking with customers. We try to convince them that adopting our product will be beneficial to them. Now, all design is persuasive to some extent. I understand that. Of late, we've seen perhaps more of a focus on discursive technology that asks users questions about their lives that may have some very positive applications around health and finance, questioning your behavior, and then hopefully adopting that for mutual gain. But we have to be careful with persuasion. We need to respect and understand that because it's such a successful method, it is prone to murkier applications. Now, one way that persuasion manifests itself is what I call experiencizing the trivial. Advertisers love this. Now, if you ever watch TV, you'll never see a film advertised. Instead, you'll see the movie event of the year. UX people do this too. And we have these concepts, these slogans that come up that, well, users don't buy products, they buy experiences. Well, they don't buy products, they actually buy better versions of themselves. Yeah, that's understandable. It's sometimes true. And it lends, not accidentally, it lends a bit more credibility to the UX design argument. But sometimes people just buy a spade, not the experience of digging. I think there's a risk here that we're adding to cognitive inflation, we're adding to clutter in the marketplace and in the minds of the world. We're positioning functional items as real lifestyle enrichers. It's kind of a pretty ugly trick. And we deplore it when advertisers use it, or we laugh at it. But yet, as a community, we're happy to speak in those terms. Now, to be ethical, persuasion obviously really should be in the user's interests as well as our own. But there are some really thorny questions in that. Who are we to determine what's in the user's interests? Isn't that their decision? And then since we're for hire, does that mean that our neutrality is compromised? Does it mean that we're ethical relativists, that we really push an agenda or we try and persuade people to behave in a way that benefits whoever's paying our rent that month? What checks and balances do we have in place when we're talking about persuasion? Because at worst, persuasion is simply exploiting human weakness to sell more stuff. Now I understand, I work in the private sector, as I'm sure most of you do. Of course we have to earn money for our employers, that's why we're hired. I don't think you can really question the ethics of that without going all the way back to saying, well, is capitalism an ethical system? But there are challenges in how we go about earning money for our companies. One of the notable features of capitalism, for better or for worse, is it tends to focus on short-term rewards, big red lines pointing up to the right, stock prices, growth, things like that. Are these really the right measures for the things we're trying to make? Let's take the example of GDP, gross domestic product. I'm sure you're aware of it. Economists, governments, they love that. They spend a lot of effort trying to maximize GDP. Now, it's a good measure of economic activity, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with good. An example, a car crash increases GDP. The insurance has to pay out, someone has to fix your car, they might have to fix the road or replant the tree you knocked down or whatever it is. A car crash increases GDP, but teaching a child to recycle has no effect. Businesses, in essence, have what's known as the logical positivist mindset. They think that the only meaningful statements are the ones that can be observed to be true. But the outcomes that we offer as designers are often intangible. Loyalty, love, enjoyment. These things kind of resist measurement. It's quite hard to weigh love. So designers have to reconcile that dissonance. A couple of ways we can do that. One, we can say, look for ways to take these intangibles and translate them to these more tangible metrics. Dollar values, return on investment. It can work. Sometimes I've certainly seen it happen in less than ethical ways. We're sort of shoehorning these things in, trying to make a fairly spurious case for them. It always leaves me feeling a little uncomfortable. The approach I prefer is to try and get the whole business's value system reorientated to recognize the value of these intangibles. They may not appear on the balance sheet, but they're still a real advantage. As I say, that's my preferred approach, but I can tell you from experience, it's extremely difficult. Another option is we get tired because it's hard, and we give up. And this is what leads us to things like dark patterns, designs that are deliberately intended to get users to behave in ways that are advantageous to us but disadvantageous to them. Now, dark patterns are clearly unethical in theory. But again, think about it a bit more, and like a lot of these discussions, I think it's not quite so black and white. A lot of it depends, of course, on our definitions of what's disadvantageous for the end user. Let's take the example of, I buy a stereo, I'm on an e-commerce site, I add a stereo to my cart, and they automatically add an extended warranty for 10% extra of the price. Now, I think I'm fairly comfortable in saying, oh, that just feels wrong to me. That doesn't feel like an ethical decision. But I can guarantee that somewhere in the organization there's someone trying to defend it as advantageous to the user. But what if it breaks? Then they'll be really glad that was added. Now, later on, I'm going to talk about a few principles that we can use to assess the ethical integrity of an argument. I'll talk about one that doesn't work here, which is what's known as the dirty hands argument. This, in essence, says, well, everyone does it, or if we don't, someone else will. It doesn't work because just because something is widespread, it doesn't mean that it's right. Racism, speeding, these things are still practiced by millions, but I think we can safely say they're probably not ethically right. Now, there are some clear negative implications of dark patterns. They're going to have business measurable effects. You'll have brand toxicity will start to mount. You may have lawsuits, that kind of stuff. But until regulation hits, and hopefully it will hit fairly soon, a lot of these arguments fall to designers. And I think those discussions demand eternal vigilance because the company that practices dark patterns really, for me, has a somewhat askew value system. And so you can suppress this dark pattern, but you can guarantee that they'll try and come up with more further down the line. So these are not easy debates. What, for instance, do we do if the business says, we understand the negative impact, we've measured it, and it's still smaller than the gains, so we're going to go ahead and do it? What if the change we see is not under our direct control? We see it happening somewhere else within the organization that we don't really have any influence over. What if we're told you do this or you lose your job? In essence, do corporate pressures amount to diminished responsibility for us as designers? It takes a lot of determination to argue these cases, but I think perhaps we should. Another topic I'd like to talk about is disruption. We know that technology is terrific at killing the middleman. That's one of its primary functions of late. We've seen that mostly in media. We've seen video stores go bust. We've seen record labels fold. We've seen newspapers have to cut their staff. We're now starting to see this in other industries. We're starting to see financial lending, taxi services, hotels all come under the wave of disruption that technology is bringing. Is disruption a positive thing? We frequently assume it is, and I think if you read the tech press, it's almost taken as a guarantee that yes, this is a good thing, this is progress. And it may well be a good thing. But if it is, we need to recognize the politics that are implied by that belief. We often deride or shrug our shoulders at the victims of disruption. Well, they're enemies of progress, or it's unlucky, but they're kind of irrelevant these days. But the truth is that disruption usually, or often, hits a certain type of people hardest, and it's often low-paid service workers. And we create unemployment for them. We create shrinking markets, shrinking wages. And in return, it offers a bit more convenience for the rich and for the middle classes. If we're not careful, disruption really becomes a flow from labor to capital. It becomes a vector for inequality. Disruption also sometimes means selectively ignoring inconvenient laws. I think we see this with some instances of that. What doesn't get discussed, of course, is sometimes those laws are there for consumer protection. But that sort of issue is rarely discussed because it's seen as anti-progressive. But again, I think the ethical designer is one who can stop and consider the impact that we're having, the human, individual impact that our disruptive technologies might be having. And of course, we have to talk about the most pressing ethical issue of modern times. I think everyone in this room recognizes the severity of the problem that climate change offers. Just on Monday, the IPCC released the results of its latest meta-analysis, and it concluded that the impact of climate change is now severe, pervasive, and irreversible. During my research for this talk, I stumbled across an idea from Slavoj Zizek about oil, and it's really stuck with me. And he says, well, oil is the result of a historical planetary catastrophe. Life was wiped out, it was extinguished, and eventually broken down into a convenient, flammable liquid. And we're blind to the macabre irony of this situation, that we're using that very same stuff to potentially bring about another potential planetary catastrophe. This quote, which was, it's by Victor Papanek, but it was Mike Montero who drew it to my attention. I think this sums up designers' role in the environmental degradation that we've seen. Sums up quite well. There are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a very few of them. Designers have directly contributed to climate change. We have designed and manufactured the gas guzzlers, the poisoners, the pollutants, the landfill. I think it's right that the design community shoulders a significant amount of blame for the future. And that future potentially looks fairly bleak. Rising sea levels, crop failures, mass migration, severe shortages in energy and water that could potentially cause human conflict. How on earth do we respond to that? Can we redeem ourselves? I'm not wildly optimistic, but of course I think we have to try. I now believe the main purpose of design over the next 50 years is to help humans survive the subsequent 50. It's tempting, I think, to think that we digital folks are off the hook because the raw materials we work with here, they're bits and pixels and electrons, they're intangible, they're not damaging in the same way. Not so fast. I think there are some counter-arguments. One being that the tech industry, we pursue some of the most aggressive upgrade cycles in the whole of consumer goods. Think of the number of devices you've owned over the past 10 years. Where are they now? What have you done with them? Where have they ended up? To create great user experiences, we tend to target top-end devices. We say, well, we need those facilities, those capabilities to achieve what we're striving for here. That, of course, helps to encourage people to buy those latest devices and to get rid of the old ones. Is fantastic UX worth the landfill? Is it worth the environmental degradation that causes? Are we comfortable being the agents of obsolescence? My second counter-argument is, of course, everything that we build runs on electricity, more or less. It has this wonderful invisibility. It convinces us it's like air. It's almost not real. But of course, it's still using the same fossil fuels, the same energy sources. It just hides the damage further upstream where we can't see it. My third point is that sustainability isn't just about conserving manufacturing resources. It's also about building things that last so that manufacturing cycle is called into action less frequently. You may be familiar with the Future Friendly campaign. It's a campaign for sustainable digital product design. In essence, it says that if you design for a diverse set of devices. And then not only does that mean that older devices can stay in use, we don't feel the need to upgrade quite so frequently, but it also says we anticipate what's coming next, so that our products, our apps, our sites will continue to work. That means less rework for our clients. It means more cost savings for business. And that's potentially a very powerful way to demonstrate the business values of sustainability. So hopefully I've convinced you there are some areas of our work that really deserve some more ethical consideration. So how do we train ourselves to think in that way? Now, as I said before, I can't provide easy answers, but I can provide a few principles that I think we can turn to. Just like design principles, these are really useful as a guiding star that we can turn to and can help us steer in uncertain waters. The first principle is, of course, just to think, to simply think. The person who's certain of his conduct at all times is probably the most dangerous person. Meanwhile, the responsible person is the one who thinks that she's never been responsible enough. Now, examining our actions takes courage, it leads us to difficult places. I think that's good. I think that means we're getting to the heart of ethical challenge. So really, this is about understanding the moments of ethical importance within our work and pausing, giving them the respect and the time that they deserve. Am I sure that this is the right course of action? What might be the implications for other people? How might it benefit them? Who might it harm? How can I mitigate the damage that I might cause? And it's so easy to skip this step, particularly if we're in a position of advantage, which many of us are. But the choice to not rationalize, to not think about the decisions we make, that is itself a moral choice. Mike Montero again, another quote of his, unethical design happens not due to malicious intent, but with no intent at all. Every now and then, discussion around ethics tend to sort of come to the idea of codifying conduct, codes of ethics, a Hippocratic oath for design, and so on. I've never found these discussions terribly convincing. I think ethics requires a little bit of mental fluidity, and codes require maybe a bit too much specificity. I think they easily become slogans, and I'm not convinced that slogans are helpful. They're quite slippery things. They're seductive. They look right. They look profound on first principles. But it's only when you analyze them that you recognize that they sometimes lack the nuance and the context that actually lies at the heart of ethical debate. One example of this is the slogan, which you may have heard, which is that if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product being sold. Now, I'll confess I have a bias here. I work for a company that offers a service that's free to use. But is that statement really valid? Does it hold up to any kind of rigorous analysis? The implication is that all non-paying business models are somewhat unethical. So that would cover some newspapers, buskers, bloggers, social networks, TV channels, search engines, financial advisors, comparison websites. Are all of these, by induction, are all of those unethical practices? Also, again, I think we have to recognize the politics inherent within that statement. If we're saying the only wholesome business model is one that the user funds, well, doesn't that rather exclude the people who can't fund it, of the poor, of the developing world, of children, of people without credit cards? What matters, of course, is the value exchange. What are you giving? What are you getting in return? And then what protections are in place in that exchange? That outcome can definitely be negative. It can also be very positive. We need to analyze things on their merits. So this kind of sloganeering, I think, actually demonstrates to me a lack of ethical thought. It's a blanket morality that's applied without consideration of the context of the work we do. I think if we learn to distrust slogans, that makes us more ethically aware people. Another useful technique is to universalize our thought. What that means really is to look at our conduct in the context of wider society. One way to do this is to ask a fairly simple question. What if everyone did what I'm about to do? If my actions were commonplace, would that world be better or worse? It's quite a powerful technique. To an extent, what we're practicing there is utilitarianism. It's the belief that we should judge actions based on how much they offer happiness to everyone involved, or how they reduce unhappiness or pain. And that can be quite a useful concept. It's still relatively highly regarded in ethical inquiry. It's a good rule of thumb, at least, with some limitations. Another useful principle to help universalize our actions is this. This comes from Immanuel Kant, and I said I wasn't going to get all philosophy-ish, but this is the only real quote. Treat humanity never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. In other words, this is really about recognizing and respecting that every human being has worth. You can't use someone with no respect for that. Instead, we have to treat every individual as a being with their own goals and work together so that we can all get closer to those things. I actually think this formulation is among the closest things we have to a guiding principle for ethical conduct in our field. I think it covers things like scale and disruption and persuasion and some of those topics that I've talked about earlier. I found it a really helpful formulation to get my head around some of the decisions that I'm trying to make. Another idea is to put your name on something. The original Apple Macintosh 1982 had these signatures. The signatures of the Apple team actually molded into the plastic inside the case. These people were so proud of the decisions they'd made and the product that resulted that they were brave enough to put their reputations on the line and say, yes, this is my decision, this is my product. How much of your work would you actually put your name to? I think we live in an era where the cult of the MVP is rising pretty strongly. How much of our work then is rushed or good enough or half-assed or let's just get it out there? Would you want strangers, complete strangers, not fellow designers? Designers, we understand the constraints and compromises. Would you want strangers to know that it was you who made that particular decision that's causing them so much hassle or joy? We can also extend this to other strangers that haven't been born yet. This is something called the grandchild test. Would you be comfortable explaining your actions today to your grandkids in 50 years' time? I think when we look at history, it's easy for us to be kind of appalled at some of the practices that happened. Slavery, witch burning, apartheid. Now, our ancestors, our predecessors, they may not have been directly responsible, but potentially they were at least complicit. And then what's the difference? Now, I'm really hopeful our sins won't be seen as that great. But will our grandchildren feel that we acted responsibly when it came to issues around the environment or social justice? Finally, I think we have to complete that circle. If we've taken the time to pause and consider the merits of our various approaches, if we've learned to distrust slogans and to really analyze the context of each decision, if we've found ways to universalize our thinking, to put it in the context of broader society and indeed the future, if we've taken then a decision that we're happy to say, yes, I will put my name by that as a decision that I think represents ethical thinking. If we've done all that, then the fifth step is to communicate. It's to talk to others about what we've learned along the way. And obviously this is my intent today. I think it's about time that we started to talk far more seriously about ethics. I think it's time that we identify peers and colleagues who do. And they do already. There are people who are really chasing these ideas down. They're committed to doing the right thing. Some of these people are actually in the companies that get the worst press. We need to find those people and embrace them and cherish them. And they in turn can nurture our own ethical thinking. So I hope in some small way that I've inspired you to start talking and to share your thoughts with others. Blog posts, perhaps, or talks of your own, maybe form ethics committees, things like that. That way, we encourage others to think about the ethical implications in their own work, and the previously invisible will eventually become blinding. Thanks for your time.